So 1969 was a very special year. I'm sure you know about it. What happened? What happened then, among other things, was the first man landed on the moon. Rather important. The Woodstock Festival took place. People were jumping around up in New York State, making all kinds of fun and excitement. An event with probability 0 occurred. The Mets won the World Series in New York. Shouldn't have happened, but it did. I'm very pleased. I'm from New York. First, the Boeing 747 took its first flight. Charles Manson conducted some major killings here in Los Angeles. Oh, and by the way, the internet was born. And the fact is, nobody noticed. Nobody saw it happen, but it probably had more impact than all the others, by and large. So let me get to the part of that story. Let's think about some words that applied to the culture and the period when all this was happening. First word is ethics, trust, open, free, shared. These are very important words that identified the culture that we worked on in those early days to create the internet. It was the early internet culture, and it's important to remember that because that philosophy, that culture, in some sense has been deteriorated badly in recent years, and I'll get back to that toward the end of my presentation. So what makes the internet tick? Well, you know, it's two things. It's the people who create, put their work on the net, and it's a culture which allows their work to be shared by everybody. And the net result is it creates communities of interest, communities that form sporadically, spontaneously, as needed. But it's based on sharing and on trust. Now, I don't have to tell you, the future is here. You are the future. Everyone knows about it. My 17-year-old granddaughter knows about it. My 99-year-old mother used it while she was alive. And in fact, they used it together, multi-generational. It's penetrating every aspect of your lives, including the response to the pandemic in a rather interesting and successful way. But the teenage is relatively young. And recently, it entered its teenage years. And what does a teenager behave? Well, it's exhibiting typical teenage behavior. It's mischievous, it's erratic, it's unruly, and most of all, it's disobedient. Now, that was the view a few years ago. And as you'll see as we move through this presentation, that it's gotten much more serious than that. Early on, we thought the teenage will grow up, become an adult, mature, and behave a little more responsibly. That's not happened. And we'll see why and how it's gone. So let's look at a brief history of the internet. In fact, how far back was somebody thinking about a thing that we now call the internet? Well, I want you to look at these predictions that was made by someone, and I'm going to ask you who it is. Gentleman said, it will be possible for a businessman in New York to instantly communicate with his colleague in London or anywhere else. He was able to do so, basically, using a device no larger than a watch to deliver any picture, character, drawing, print, voice, anywhere in the world. Now, if you look at this, it's really talking about what we now call the internet. Long distance, instant, inexpensive, send any kind of medium you want. Well, who said that? Well, since you can't answer me directly, I'll tell you. It was this gentleman. If you recognize his picture, that's Nikola Tesla. And he said that more than 100 years ago. Now, the technology was not yet ready, but in fact, he had a vision way back then. So this is not a new concept. This concept was a long time in coming and developing. In fact, there were others along the way. For example, H.G. Wells, his World Brain, that's him. In 1945, Vannevar Bush with his collective memory, Memex. In 1960, Licklider with his man-computer symbiosis, a galactic network. In 1969, around the time of the internet, of the ARPANET creation, I had an internet vision. And in fact, I showed the following photo early on in the 1970s. It's a picture of a user at a remote terminal with no wires and no electricity accessing the rest of the community. The idea of mobile, wireless, portable technology was already there long before it existed. So these visions were there. People were talking about it. Now, before the beginning, what was going on? Well, I entered the MIT graduate program, as you were told. That was the same as the International Geophysical Year, when scientists across the world were investigating the behavior of the Earth, its climate, its science, its technology, its geography, etc. And as it turned out, in October 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik. And that beep may be annoying to you today. It was terribly annoying to those of us in America and probably around the world. Because what had happened? The Russians beat us to space, us being America in this case, or the rest of the world. Well, then President Eisenhower said, we've been caught short. The Russians are ahead of us, and that will never happen again. So shortly thereafter, a few months later, he created the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA. And its job was basically to promote STEM technology, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and increase the capability of the United States STEM technology. It started funding research in those areas. But meanwhile, in 59, the Soviets hit the moon. They were first. In 61, first person in space, a Russian. In 66, they actually banged into Venus. Finally, in 69, the United States caught up and we put men on the moon. So that's the background in which the early days of the ARPANET and the race to space and, as it turns out, to the internet was taking place. Now, basically, getting started for my research, basically, when I got to MIT, I said, I want to work for the absolutely best professor I know there. And that was a gentleman named Claude Shannon. That's what it looks like. It was a brilliant man. And if you don't know his name, look him up tonight. Google Claude Shannon, a remarkable scientist. He had two enormously important capabilities. One, he was a great mathematician. And two, he was a great engineer with intuition about the systems he was studying. It was practical, theoretical, and that combination of expertise often generates wonderful and impressive and important results. Look the man up, fantastic person. Well, all my classmates were doing dissertations following up what he had done. Coding theory, information theory, they were all working on this. And Shannon, however, had already done the foundational work. What was left over were hard problems and probably, at that point, not of great significance. And I said, that's not what I want to do. I wanted to find a problem with lots of potential in an area nobody was looking at. Well, at MIT, I was surrounded by computers. And I knew that sooner or later, they'd have to talk with each other. And as it turns out, there was no adequate technology to allow that to happen. So here we are. Here was a problem, a fresh problem, an important one that would have impact. And I actually saw how to solve it. Well, that was a perfect solution, perfect environment for my research dissertation. I'm saying that to the students who are listening to me today. Look for a problem which will have impact, which will be remembered some years from now, and not just be an exercise, a homework exercise. Try to do something significant. It'll keep you excited, and when it's done, you have great gratification. So, in those early years at MIT and UCLA, I'll show you that decade. In 59, I decided to study this problem. In 61, I published my thesis proposal. I'll show it to you in a moment. It was the first paper on modern data networking. In 62, I introduced the idea of packet switching and analyzed the way it would behave. In 62, I filed my dissertation. It became an MIT book. In 63, I joined the UCLA faculty. In the 1960s, even though I had laid out a prescription as to what a data network should look like, the telecommunication industry couldn't care. They wanted nothing to do with it. They said it wouldn't work. And more than that, they said, even if it did work, we want nothing to do with it. And if anybody asks, I'll explain why that was the case. Happily, in 1966, the agency that Eisenhower put together got interested in creating a network. So from then on, they began to put it together. In '69, the network came to life. The network locomotive started its wild ride, which led us today to the internet over which you and I are communicating today. Now some details. That's a picture of my thesis proposal. It was filed in July of '61, and the title was called Information Flow in Large Communication Nets. The emphasis on large is important. I didn't want to deal with a 10, 20, 50 node network because, as I learned from Shannon, when you make things very large in numbers or capacity or people or throughput, phenomena emerge that you won't see in small networks, in small systems. So the idea of large was important, thanks to Shannon's, but that was basically the key, the essence of what he did for information theory. Now, this is the opening line in my proposal, and it talks about the following. It says, basically, we're going to study large networks. These networks will have links and nodes. They're going to be connected, and they're going to move messages around through them and transmit them, sort them, store them, receive them, etc. What am I interested in? How long does it take for a message to get through? How much capacity should each channel have? How large should the storage capacity be? What should be the routing discipline, the queuing discipline? When does it jam up? When does it block? When does it crash? What's the transient behavior? All these wonderfully interesting problems which formed the base of what I started to research. So what was the problem? The problem I was looking at is that voice traffic is very different from data traffic, which would be the traffic that computers would use to communicate. With voice, typically you create a link of channels across the network, you dedicate them to our conversation, and even if we go silent, that sequence of links is committed to our conversation. Well, in speech, you're silent about 1/3 of the time, and that's quite acceptable. But data traffic is different. Most of the time, there's none of it there. If you give it a channel to send it over, it'll be busy a small fraction of the time, less than 1% of the time. You hit a key on your keyboard, it takes a character, wraps it up, and sends it off as a packet. 1,000,000 units of time later, you hit the second key. So the channel is almost silent all the time. You can't dedicate a channel, a dedicated pipe for data. So what to do? The solution? Share those resources, dynamically share them. When I'm not using it, you can use it. When neither one of us is using it, a third person can use it. Now that concept was already present in time sharing of computer systems. In that picture, this red box is the computer processor. When one of the users are not using it, someone else can jump in and share the time. That idea of dynamic resource sharing was already there. So I said, look, let's apply that same concept to data networks. Those red channels need to be shared dynamically. Let's invent a networking technology which will allow that to happen. When I'm not using it, someone else can, etc. So the key results I had were these. I set up a model, and as you heard before, I introduced queuing theory as a really important technique to study these networks. Now, the important point here is not only did I use it for my dissertation, but it launched a whole army of people up to the present day who are using that kind of mathematical theory to analyze the performance of computers and networks. It exploded in terms of the tool to use. I solved the network model, got network performance. I optimized some of the components. What were they? The capacity, the topology, the routing procedures. I evaluated distributed adaptive routing. Why? Because in a large network, no one node can be responsible for everything. It's too vulnerable, there's too much traffic, etc. It's too slow. So you let everybody participate in the control. I evaluated different queuing disciplines, and among them was chopping messages into small pieces, later called packets. I published that in April '62. I'll show you the equation in just a moment. And I basically talked about the underlying principles of data networks. So, in terms of the packet switching, the model I produced was a model that looked like this, which allowed messages to come in, chop them up into fixed size pieces, and circulate them around until it all popped out. The analysis came up with that equation in April of '62. That's an exact expression for the response time for messages of certain sizes using packet switching. The network model was more general. Of course, it was a general arbitrary network. And to define some parameters, let T be the mean response time across the network. Let lambda I be the traffic on the ith channel. Let gamma be the network throughput, the messages per second that get delivered. And let T sub I be the time waiting for and using that ith channel. Now, what you want to do is find the mean response time, the average network delay for this thing. And it turns out I developed the following equation, a very straightforward equation in terms of the parameters I defined. And it's the key equation of a network delay. And believe it or not, it's exact. There's no approximation. It doesn't matter what the queuing discipline or the arrival statistics or the message statistics. It's an exact solution. So it opened up the way to study these networks. And that was, again, delivered in my thesis of December 62. Now, some optimality. Suppose we have C megabits per second to allocate among all the channels. What's the optimal way to do it to minimize the response time? And the answer is, it's that. The ith channel should have that much capacity. I won't define all the parameters, but there's an exact equation for it. And if you use that capacity and plug it into the network response time that I showed you a moment ago, this is the response time. This is the minimum response time for the optimized network. And it says things about topology. It says things about routing, etc. So these are some of the key equations that came out. Now, what are the principles? You know, again, to the students, I say, once you solve a problem, even optimize it, and you get a result, you can't then just walk away from that. You have to ask yourself, what did that system tell me? What am I learning? What can I use? What are the underlying principles? Don't just give me an equation. Explain to me the way Shannon would. Here's the intuition. Here's the physical phenomena of what's going on. See, the underlying principles were these. First of all, resource sharing. Demand access, as I told you before. I don't use it, you can use it. Only assign a resource to data that's present. Don't wait around for something that's not yet there. And some examples are well known to you. It's message switching, polling, asynchronous time division multiplexing, and of course, packet switching. And then I analyze that. Dynamic resource sharing is the principle. Share resources dynamically on an as-needed basis. Economy of scale was another principle. Turns out that bigger systems are much better in terms of performance in every direction, in every dimension. That comes out of some of the equations. That was not known before among the queuing theorists, but it came out of the network analysis. And lastly, distributed control. It's important. It gives you scalability. It gives you reliability. It's efficient, stable, robust, scalable, fault tolerant, and most of all, it works. It's hard to analyze, but if you throw the control among all the nodes, the fact that it works, and we demonstrated that both first in simulation and then with the actual network, that's the important result. Okay. So these threads of inquiry into the way networks should behave, while ARPA grew, remember it began in '58, while it grew, the research community, example what I was showing a moment ago, was generating what an internet technology could be. There were three independent efforts. One was mine at MIT. I was working on the mathematical theory and the underlying principles. And basically, on that same time scale, in May of '61, I put in my thesis proposal. In April '62, I came with the packet switching. At the end of '62, the thesis. Meanwhile, there was another effort at RAND Corporation, Paul Barron. He was studying some of the structure and some of the engineering aspects. He, in September '62, began to talk about this from a major paper. In August of '64, published a number of documents, and that was his contribution, very significant. Meanwhile, over in England, at the National Physical Laboratory, Donald Davies began to look at networking, and he began to talk about it in the middle of 1966, and later developed the first packet switch node in England. Sadly for him, the British decided not to endorse more than one node, and one node does not a network make. Had the British funded more than one node, the person speaking to you today would have a British accent instead of an American accent, but they failed to do that. Okay, so there was a mathematical theory of packet networks early on. What's really important to understand is the theory was established well before the technology was implemented, which means we understood how it should work and what needed to be developed. But as I say, nobody in the telecom industry cared. We had to wait until ARPA stepped in. But ARPA was now poised to catalyze this work because they needed one. So ARPA steps in. Licklider had described something called a galactic network. Theory had been developed. I had done that along with some others. The second leader of the ARPA group, the computer group at ARPA, tried to fund a small network, and that failed for bureaucratic reasons. The next head of the ARPA group saw a need for network computers because he had funded many sites across the country. Each one had developed specific and unique expertise. And he figured, let's network all this expertise together so people at one site could log on to a machine at another site and use their resources there. So ARPA saw a need in 1966 to create a network. Hooray, now the network technology and the theory could be used. The next head of the computer group at ARPA came to ARPA, and he was designed to, as a chief scientist, to build a network. His name was Larry Roberts. And here's a quote from him. He said, in order to spend millions of dollars and stake his reputation on it, he needed to be sure it would work. And he knew it would work because he was a classmate of mine at MIT. And he saw the work I had done. He had written the compiler on which I ran my simulations, etc. So it was all going to happen. And let's see what happened. In 67, the year after they decided to do it, ARPA gathered a bunch of us to create a network spec. In 68, they accepted a contract from a company called Bolt, Beranek and Newman to manufacture and deploy the network. In 69, my lab at UCLA was selected to be the first node. Steve Crocker, Vince Cerf, who am I missing now? Charlie Klein, a number of others were in my group. In 69, UCLA puts out a press release months before the first switch arrived. And here is the press release. It was my 1969 vision. And here is what I said at the end of that quote. It says, as of now, computer networks are still in their infancy, but as they grow up and become more sophisticated, we'll probably see the spread of computer utilities. What's a computer utility? You call those things web-based IP services today. Continuing, which like present electric and telephone utilities, well, that's an always-on, invisible system, will service individual homes and offices across the country. It means you can get on anywhere from any device at any time. So I had articulated a vision at that point. Now, what's missing from that vision? What's missing is the entire social networking technology. The idea that this was about people talking to people and not computers talking to computers. Totally missed the social network inside of it. One piece of this vision, which has not yet been realized, is this invisible concept. The internet is not invisible. It's clunky. You use uncomfortable devices like cell phones with tiny keyboards or computers with bad cursors, and every application looks different. The invisibility is not there. We'll talk about that later. At any rate, the press release came out. There was a vision months before the imp arrived. Finally, on September 2nd, the first router was connected to UCLA. And a month later, a month and a half later, the first internet message is sent from our node at UCLA to the second node up at Stanford Research Institute. So what did it look like in 1969? Going deep into the history now. At UCLA, we had a host computer running. I was running a time-shared system for the computer science department. And then in September 69, that first switch arrived, the interface message processor, the first router, the first packet switch. And it was installed at UCLA. Well, there was only one node. This is what it looked like. That is the first switch. That's the front panel. And here's what it looks like inside. It's so ugly, it's beautiful. You have to love this machine. It's old, wonderful technology. But UCLA was the first host, first imp. In October, a second node was placed up at Stanford Research Institute, 350 miles to the north. That's the second host, the second imp. And that is the first link of the internet backbone ever. And it was running at a blazing 50,000 bits per second. Now, everybody's going to smirk. That's not even worth buying these days. In those days, it was really fast. It was broadband for us. Now we had a network, a 2-node network, which means we could now basically test out the way the ARPA network should run. And how is it supposed to run? You sit at one host, log in through the network to a remote host, and use that remote host as if you were a local user. So we wanted to test that out, which means we wanted to connect these two computers together. Well, we decided to keep a log of what's going on. This is the beautifully sophisticated imp log. We stole it from the host computer document. The most critical entry in that log is this one. It occurred on October 29, 1969, 10:30 at night. Charlie Klein, he signed it over to the right, CS key. He says, we talked to SRI host to host. The setup was this, as I showed you, UCLA connected to SRI. That was the first message on the internet ever. First message ever. Well, you already heard from the professor what the first message was, and you probably know it. But let's go through it. Was it a good message like Samuel Morse telegraph message, what hath God wrought? Or Alexander Graham Bell, the first telephone message, Watson, come here, I need you? Or Neil Armstrong, one giant leap for mankind? Those guys were smart. They understood what PR and multimedia was about. We had no such good message. All we wanted to do, as you were told, was to log in from UCLA to SRI. Now, to log in, we have to type those 3 yellow letters, L-O-G. And the SRI computer is smart enough to type the IN for us. So we just had to type 3 letters. And there's the setup. We had Charlie Klein, one of my programmers down at our end, and Bill Duval up at the other end at SRI. And to make sure we knew what was going on, we had a telephone connection from our side to SRI. Because here is a new technology, it's packet switching. Does it work? We can't tell easily. So we had a telephone connection. Now think about what that means. We are using the telephone technology to prove out a new technology which is going to replace the telephone technology. The irony is beautiful. So what did we do? We had Charlie send the L, and he asked Bill, you get the L? Yep, got the L. Sent the O, you get the O? Yep, got the O. Send the G, you get the G? Crash. The system crashed. So a few comments. First of all, the first message ever was low, as you heard. And I took the liberty to change that to mean, lo and behold, look what's coming. Anticipate, it's a prediction. The second thing is what crashed. It wasn't our computer. It wasn't our switch. It wasn't the internet, the high-speed line. It wasn't the switch at SRI. It was the SRI host. It was basically a buffer overflow. We fixed it, ran it, and got the message going. So the first message ever was low, as in lo and behold. And that's now become a documentary by Werner Herzog. Here's a poster describing it. You can find that lo and behold documentary on Netflix and other places on YouTube. And I'm going to show you the opening scenes from that documentary, because there you're going to see the imp where it lives now and where it lived then. You're going to see the 4 square feet where the internet began with the machine that created it.
Let's enter this very special place. That machine over there is the first piece of internet equipment. This is a military hardened machine. It has a unique odor, and it was from here that the first message was sent. A revolution began.
So you've now glimpsed the birthplace of the internet. It's room 3420, Belter Hall at UCLA. And that's the same machine that started the internet. So let's watch the internet grow now. Well, first of all, as young engineers, we didn't know any better. We were young, so let's go for it. We launched an effort to do what we've never done before. We wanted to create a new technology. It's basically an open running field. There were no barriers, no legacy systems to worry about. And so we had a model that's been analyzed. We knew how it should behave, as I told you. But as engineers, we knew that we didn't know everything. So we knew we'd have to experiment with it, measure it, test it, stress it, try to break it. And that's what the early days of the ARPANET/internet were all about. At UCLA, we were the network measurement center, and we tried to beat the heck out of that machine system. And we could crash it almost any time we wanted. And every time we did, we found out what the trouble was, where the fault was, either software or hardware, fixed it so it wouldn't happen again. Now, from 1969, when it began, the network looked like this. By the way, UCLA was the first node in September, SI in October, UC Santa Barbara in November, and University of Utah in December. That was the first 4-node network, and that's the one we began to test. And shortly thereafter, it grew. And it grew from 69 to 1988 very nicely. Here's a 1988 map, for example. It was crossing the country, even crossed to Europe as well. This network, it grew very well, quickly, friendly, broadly, until 1988. What happened? A graduate student, Robert Morris, unleashed the first internet worm. And it spread across the network, and it bothered a lot of us. We said, uh-oh. And then we said, oh, just a graduate student, an aberration. Oh, well, don't worry about it. What a mistake. But we went merrily along. From 1988 to 1994, it continued to grow. The dot-coms came online. The backbone went to gigabit speeds, thanks, by the way, to Al Gore. The web began to roll out until 1994, a couple of lawyers in America introduced spam. We said, uh-oh, and this time we said, ouch, that hurts. Because this spam message reached across the network, and we reacted very strongly. We had reached a tipping point in 1994. We had no patents, there was no private ownership, no IP, no intellectual property concern. We were nerds in our element. As I say, we were basically creating a new technology, a new world. But 1994, things changed quickly. The web became a household presence. Some applications and systems appeared. Basically, spam came, as I said. It was widely publicized. Those two attorneys became the two most hated people on the internet. They were famous green card lawyers who spammed the internet. Massive mailing, highly visible. And has anybody ever seen the first spam message? Because if you haven't, you're going to see it right now. That is the first spam message. It was launched on April 12th, 1994. It basically said, there's a green card lottery. We lawyers will help you get into the lottery, hire us and pay us. They were advertising their services on our internet. How dare they? They were sending email over the place. You're not allowed to do that. We sent email back, said, stop, cease and desist, shame on you. We sent so much email back to them, we crashed their server. So as an unintended consequence of the first spam message, we created the first denial of service attack. Well, things are out of the bag now. People realized you could use the network for advertising, and things went downhill from there. The dark side began to appear. And these are all the components of the dark side, as you know: spam, invasion of privacy, pornography. You know the list, you know better than I do. You're subject to it all the time. Dark side had emerged. Now, what are the enablers of the internet, and how does it lead to a dark side? Well, it allows anybody to reach hundreds of millions of users easily, quickly, no cost in money or effort, anonymously. Basically, that's a perfect formula for the dark side. Just imagine, you can hide in your basement and at no cost reach millions of people and do good or bad as you like. So that's part of the problem that we have today. Well, what happened to the internet that I knew back in those early days? Our beautiful research network, which was of enormous magnificence, had been hijacked to sell detergent. There were 50 million users worldwide by 1995. And the commercial world recognized, as soon as that spam message came out, was a shopping machine, a gossip chamber, an entertainment channel, a social club. Basically, the internet became a money-making machine. And no longer was it a research engine, an engineering challenge, a technology development. It was a business. And once you bring profit-making, money-making into a system, it totally changes the complexion, the motivation, and the activities. And that's where we are today. We've gone from having nuisance hackers, nasty nuisances, to serious players, nation states, organized crime, conducting serious offenses on the network. So now let's see who brought all this technology to us before we try to address the problems. Well, some of the internet people, they were the early pioneers. They were the implementers. They were the value adders. They were the launchers. And finally, there were the billionaires. Time runs down the page, and it took 20 to 25 years to go from a concept on top to a money-making machine on the bottom. Now, the interesting point is, look, these are all wonderful people. Look at them, you praise them, you adore them. Look how wonderful they are. This concept was in the air. If none of those people were ever born, this still would have happened. We'd still have an internet because the technology caught up with the vision. It was in the air, and finally when that happened, we were going to have an internet. So it's okay to recognize these people, but it would have happened anyway. Now, what are the next phases of the internet infrastructure? Nomadic computing, everywhere access, mobility, blockchain and distributed ledgers, IoT, intelligent software agents, and invisibility, which will eventually come. So let's consider the user. Many years ago, this quote was saying, a user has no idea what's going on behind that screen. The future is in the art of making it disappear. That was stated in 1999 by a senior vice president of AOL. That's still a challenge. As I said, the internet is anything but invisible right now. It's far too clumsy in many ways. Invisibility. It should be as simple to use as electricity. Electricity, it's 2 or 3 prongs in the wall. You stick into that socket and you get electricity. End of story. You don't need a protocol. You don't have to log in. You don't have to identify yourself or anything. The internet is not yet there. And hopefully that will happen where the internet will disappear into the infrastructure. So it's not as convenient as it is today. When I walk into a room, the room should know I'm there. I should be able to talk to it. It should give me the services that I ask for that match. It's my known profile and privileges and preferences. I should be able to interact with it the same way I'm doing with you right now, with speech, with gestures, with touch, etc., even with smell. How about a brainwave interface? People are talking about that our brains will be talking to the internet directly and vice versa. It should disappear into the infrastructure. So IoT helps that. It puts the devices into the walls, into our fingernails, into our desks, our cars, our rooms, etc. That with intelligent software agents embedded in the network will hopefully make it disappear and seamlessly deliver the services wherever I go, whenever I want. So my vision of the future internet is to be a pervasive global nervous system. And by pervasive, I mean it's disappeared into the infrastructure and is everywhere. So where do we go from here? Convergence of everything: content, function, technology, apps, services, changes in the way you do everything, a future that you understand and you've been using, extreme mobility, mass personalization, addiction to video, read that as TikTok, for example, or Instagram, location-based services, surprising applications, big changes in the way you behave. Now, the infrastructure that's going to make that happen is easy to predict. We've been very good at it. Nomadic computing is going to be coming, ubiquitous computing, intelligent software agents, embedded technology, intelligent devices. We can see all of these things happening. Smart spaces, IoT, as I said, virtual reality. It will be a pervasive global nervous system, like I said. But the apps and services are very hard to predict. If you ask someone, what's the internet going to look like? I'm telling you, the infrastructure, this green stuff is easy. The absent services, you just can't predict. You can't predict that, you can't predict them. Look at the things we have failed to predict and surprised us. Email came suddenly, nobody saw it coming. The World Wide Web suddenly appeared. Peer-to-peer file sharing, blogs, user-generated content, YouTube, for example, search engine dominance, shopping engines, social networking, distributed ledgers, blockchain, cryptocurrency, micropayments, reputation systems, circles of trust and expert curation. Some of these are coming, some of them have come already. Nobody saw them arriving. They came out of the blue, they were sudden, unanticipated, and most of all, they were explosive, and they took over the internet in a matter of months. So we've created a global system which will constantly surprise us and shock us. And that's a good thing. There's opportunity for all you young people out there to create these new surprises for us. So, inventing the future. At UCLA, we created just now the UCLA Connection Lab. It looks like that. It's basically a vision to shape the future of the internet. It's pushing collaborative research. It's full of graduate students, visitors, faculty, postdocs, etc. The underlying theme, I left out the letter E. The underlying theme is connectivity. That's what drives what goes on in the UCLA Connection Lab. And here's an example of some of the things we're looking at. And the point is to replicate the environment that led to the internet and do it in an invisible way. So this is a bright new future, the UCLA Connection Lab. I'm directing it right now, and it's going to provide considerable collaboration across the world. And I'd love for some of you folks down in Mexico, in the universities, to participate with this and engage with us. Now, just a few words to the students again. 5 golden rules and guidelines to do research. First is, when you do research, ask yourself, will what you're doing be remembered 100 years from now? The answer is probably not. How about 10 years from now? It should have some longevity, should be important enough to be remembered. So think about that when you pick a research topic. Secondly, don't fall in love with your mathematical model. Make approximations, change the model. Don't be stuck with the one you started with. There are ways to do it so you can solve it. Third, please don't resort to using simulation instead of your brain. Let simulation give you clues as to the way a system behaves, but don't fool yourself into thinking that the simulation explains everything. You've got to be able to figure out what's the mathematics behind it, what are the principles, what's the understanding. And there I say it, understand your own results. And lastly, search in an area that's not behaving properly. Find something that's unusual and scratch your head and say, gee, that's funny, why? And go after that. So those are my professorial guidelines to doing good research. The paradigm is this one: make a model, analyze it, optimize it, understand it, what you did, implement it, measure and test it, and start over again. And go through that cycle till you get a successful system. Well, we've come a long way. Well, have we? So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kleinrock. We can applaud, but it's not easy. Is there any question that we can make to Mr. Kleinrock? One question from one student is, what do you think in the next 100 years is about this area?
Well, I indicated my goal is, and I hope it will happen, is that we will have an invisible network where you don't have to fiddle around with devices, that you'll be able to use human interaction capability with speech, with brain waves, with haptics, etc., They'll be far easier to use. But hopefully, we'll get away from the dark side of the internet. Right now, I am concerned that the internet is being splintered. It's being balkanized. Nation states are putting walls around their internet to protect them. Just look at China. Russia's talking about it. Turkey's talking about it. If we end up with isolated pieces of the internet, we will have lost the power of the internet to be a global system that everybody can access and use across the world. To stop that's going to be tricky. It's going to involve all of us, not only the scientists and technologists, it's going to involve industry, it's going to involve government, it's going to involve basically the public, the users. The users have to start complaining that their privacy is being violated. They have to complain that the system is not secure and hold the industry responsible when things fail. And that means that as users, we can't be passive in our response to unpleasant behavior on the part of the network and the industry. We have to speak up and hold them accountable and say, look, I want to be able to express my privacy settings that I want you to apply to me. When's the last time Google asked you, what privacy and security do you want? They don't ask you that. Occasionally you see somebody doing that. You should be able to do it in a simple way. So in terms of the 100-year, that's awfully far. But in the next 10 to 15 years, I'll look at invisibility, a correction to the splintering, to the balkanization, and to some way to make industry responsible with some of the dark side that's appearing.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, what do you think about the Erlang programming language?
The Erlang programming language? I'm not familiar with it.
Okay. Another one is, how do you think the internet would be different if security had been implemented from the beginning?
Very good question. Why, in fact, was there no good security implemented early on? Well, the fact in those early days, as my opening slide said, we trusted everybody. We were well behaved. It was free and shared. And so we didn't anticipate, A, that the network would become global, and B, that it would involve malicious behavior on the part of the users. So we didn't build, I mean, I knew everybody on the internet in those early days. They were all my friends, and they were well behaved. So we didn't implement anything. Now, what should we have done? What could we have done? We could have done at least two things. One, we could have put in strong file authentication, which means that if you send me a file, there's a way to prove that what you sent is what I received. It's not been changed, it's not been replaced. Secondly, we should have put in strong user authentication. So when I'm communicating with someone, there's a way to prove that it is the person they claim to be. Now, we could have done that, but we didn't. And had we done that, the first thing we should have done was turn it off, because in those days we didn't need it. And as some of these abuses came online, we should have cranked up that capability and at least protected to a certain degree some of the violations we see today. But had we done that, it would have been a slower progress, but I still think that the malicious users, the nation states, could still have found ways in. After all, the hackers and the abusers are always one step. It's easy to network. Is that the important part of the underlying protocol and software has not been in a focused package. For example, flow control, the things that control the way things go in and out of the network, is all over the software. Somebody adds their own piece of flow control, their own piece of control mechanism, and they don't anticipate how they're going to interact. So the fact that there's not a single point of design on flow control, a single point of design on security, leaves openings for people to find ways in. And that was a mistake. And it's very hard to correct nowadays. I think we're going to continue to live with a network which is not all that secure. And it's going to require some very sophisticated protection. And there are some ways around it. If perhaps you're familiar with something called homomorphic encryption. Homomorphic encryption means that you can take data and encrypt it, take the programs that process it and encrypt that program, and let the encrypted program operate on the encrypted data without ever revealing either one, which means if a hacker steals data, it's useless to them until somebody has to read it for their own use. Well, that's a process that we're working on right now. There's a lot of work in the cryptography field on that encryption thing. So there are possibilities coming forward, but it's a really hard problem because we didn't build it in initially.
Thank you.
We have another question from Mauricio Alejandro Garza.
Hi, Mr. Kleinrock. Thank you for coming with us. And my question is, what do you think will be future threats for the internet, or are they unpredictable?
You're right in both questions. I can tell you some of them. It's very hard to predict what they're going to be. It's like applications and services. We're going to be surprised by the way things occur. The kinds of threats we're seeing now, I mentioned one already, the balkanization of the internet, which separate into walled gardens, which don't communicate. Fake news is a big issue these days, and it's more a social issue than a technological issue. Yes, there are artificial intelligence programs which are trying to attack it, and using the big data approach is very good. But I still see fake news as a serious issue. That's related to the social network problem of how news spreads very quickly. And the more outrageous as it is, the more quickly it spreads. And that convinces human mind to behave in a certain way, which is not where you and I can get our hands on and fix it with technology. So it's not only a technological problem, it certainly is a social problem as well. The future attacks, anybody's guess, but it's going to come. You'll be surprised at what's going to be hitting us next, and so will I.
Abraham Collins, can you please share your question, please?
Hi, Mr. Kleinrock. So I think you've answered part of it already, but my question is, looking back at the way the internet grew and how it was developed, what would you have done differently?
Well, I told you, you said, I did answer part of it. We would have put in those two protective mechanisms, strong user and strong file authentication. I think we should have started to anticipate that this would lead to the commercial world very quickly. We didn't foresee the rate of growth. It's been exponential since day one, but the fact that it would penetrate the entire planet. As you saw in my early vision, I never anticipated that my mother would be on the internet, for example. And even if we had anticipated that, I'm not sure what we could have done about it. One thing we should have done, by the way, is not make the users of the internet today have to see things like http:// etc. I mean, that came up out of the nerds, and it basically became visible to the average consumer, which is ridiculous. Some of the interfaces, some of the user interfaces are just awful. And we didn't pay much attention to that because we were all nerds, as I say, used to green characters on a white screen, etc. I think had we educated the public in terms of what's acceptable behavior, would have been helpful. But one thing we could do now, which we're not doing, and that is to present to the consumer a picture of what privacy policy is being applied to them right now. Most people just click the I agree to get into the application or the service. Well, sometimes when you click, you've given them permission to read your email, to look at your contact database, to look at your password file without even knowing it. It would be nice, and it's not that hard, to create a simple graphical diagram which shows it, the kinds of things they're doing to you, the major things you're concerned about, that some of which I just mentioned. And basically, the user should be able to look at that and say, either that's acceptable or not. These are the things they're doing to me. And here's what I want. This is the policy I'm willing to accept. And if they don't match, don't use the app, or maybe you negotiate with the app provider to give up on one thing to give in on another. That doesn't happen. That's not even present these days. And I think that's an important area where it'll help the consumer to protect them and make it easy to use. But that's an open-ended question. It's a good question. Maybe someone of your generation can help answer it.
Thank you.
Juan Carlos Juarez, you have the word.
Hello, Mr. Kleinrock. It's an honor having you. And well, my question is, how do you think data transmission will be like in the future? Do you think there will be a point on which we can transfer petabytes of information in microseconds?
So the answer is yes, but understand there is a law of physics you can't get around. It's called the speed of light. Okay? And it's going to take you a millimicrosecond to send something about a meter distance. Now, and that latency has now become, I had a paper called the latency bandwidth trade-off, which points that out. Now that we're going to high speeds, and we've already had global distances for many, many decades, we have to decide how to overcome that latency problem. Aside from that, there's almost no limit. You know, the bandwidth of the electromagnetic system is infinite. If you count distance first times times bits per second. So it's an enormous capability. Yes, we're going to send lots and lots. And of course, two of the things that are coming, which are being generated right now, one is quantum computing, magnificent field, really important. Second, the whole idea of distributed ledgers and the blockchain technology to allow a distributed database to be reliable and irrefutable. But to solve that distributed problem, it's still going on. Some of the protocols now do have fallacies, do have vulnerabilities. It's a great problem, but in answer to the question, yeah. Gigabits per second. And by the way, the whole idea of 5G is to send very high bandwidth over very short distances and highly directed. And therein you can see the bandwidth that continues to grow in an unlimited fashion.
Thank you.
Carlos Estrada, can you ask your question?
Hi, Mr. Kleinrock. Thank you for coming to Tec de Monterrey virtually. My question is kind of like a follow-up to that question. So given that in the recent years there have been many innovations on space travel and possibly interplanetary travel in the future, I wanted to ask you about what you think are going to be the limitations of implementing internet across different planets, given, as you said, the speed of light might be an issue, given that the speed of light or the light takes 3 minutes to go, for example, from Earth to Mars. That would be kind of like a challenge to have probably a video chat or even a voice call. So what do you think are any ways that we could solve that, or is that even possible in the near future?
So, excellent point. You know, there's a whole effort started at JPL called the Interplanetary Network, where they looked at delay-tolerant technology, because as you say, speed of light is a severe limitation when you're talking about interplanetary distances. There's another funny problem with interplanetary, and that is the planet itself gets in the way if you're on the wrong side of it. So you go into dark periods for a long time. Well, you can solve that with bouncing things off, you know, satellites around the planet. But it is the delay that's, it's an enormous problem. And so you're gonna have to go to different modes. For example, one-way video will work. Interactive video will not. So you can still watch your favorite Netflix, you know, picture, but you're not going to be able to comment back immediately. There's no easy solution to that at this point. And yet it's a very interesting research problem as to how to deal with and accept the tolerance. I mean, any distributed system, I talk about a blockchain, it would fail miserably at interplanetary distances. Nobody would ever have an agreed upon a ledger. So, young man, that's a wonderful challenge. If you solve any of that, you'll have 100-year remembrance.
Okay, now David Luna de Leon.
Hello, Mr. Kleinrock. My question is, do you think that having more open source software projects and standards will help make the internet a better place or more secure? At the beginning of your presentation, you talk about the sense of community and openness. So I was wondering about that.
Absolutely, yes. The idea of intellectual property protection, patenting, etc., is an important issue for business, no question about it. But many organizations are releasing their software in an open source fashion. Almost all of the blockchain technology is open source. And yet people are still able to move ahead and produce a product that's of value. It allows people to check the accuracy, security, and correctness of software, and it speeds up development enormously. After all, we are a human race, and we want to move forward as a race, not as Google or as Netflix or whatever. So I think the openness is an important concept. Another related concept, by the way, is the following. Why did the internet beat out proprietary networks? IBM was there trying to promote their SNA network in the middle 70s. DECnet was coming on. WangNet was coming on. The corporation were trying to impose standards of their own on the public. And they had a lot of power. If you wanted to do networking with IBM machines, you had to use SNA. And IBM was the pervasive computer platform. And yet, down below at the ground level, there was a groundswell bubbling up, a thing called the internet. You may hear from Bob Metcalf, Ethernet was bubbling up. Those technologies beat out the standards imposed from above. If you try to impose a standard from above versus having a grassroots movement below, the grassroots movement should win and often does win for just the reason that's accepted by the larger population. So openness is another example of that. It does challenge the corporations how to make their profits that they need to. But there's a whole other question about large corporations. Is it good to have a company as large as Google or Amazon or whomever? It's a good question. I mean, the search engine market, in some sense, naturally is a winner-take-all market, because the more access you have to data, the more people use it, the more data comes in. But it should not be abused the way it's being abused now. I mean, using unreasonable methods in terms of what gets the first hit on the search engine. We had this a year ago, 2019 was the 50th anniversary of the internet. We had a major conference at UCLA called Internet 50. And I ran that thing, and the focus was not on the history, not on the wonders of this internet, but what are the problems? What's the hard part? We had some wonderful discussion. You might want to look it up, Internet 50 at UCLA. All the videos are available. And we had Google, we had Amazon, we had Peter Thiel arguing different things. We had the major players. We had a lot of social networking issues. We had a lot of hacking issues, et cetera. And that issue did come up. What's the place for, is bigger better? And there's arguments on both sides. But in general, there's a lot of negatives to it. And to get back to your question, David, the open software idea begins to break down some of the grip that a large organization has on you and me.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
And the last question is from Juan Barajas.
Hello, Professor. So you mentioned a future with we would have this invisibility regarding the internet. but we just won't have to think between this bridge that we currently have between that connection. So given that we are dealing with data, how do you envision the aspect of privacy?
So I can make an offhand statement, which is, and it's only partly true, your privacy is gone. Get over it. You gave it up. Not only you, but your parents did. Once you put your name in a telephone book, you put your phone number and your address. Once you use a credit card, you're revealing an enormous amount of information. You know, what you're buying, where you're buying, how much you paid, or where you're located now. You carry a cell phone around. Everything about you is revealed constantly. And you do that voluntarily for whatever reason. You get some benefit. So privacy has been badly compromised, in some ways voluntarily, in other ways maliciously by certain industrial groups. So to recover it is really hard. The joke I like to make is, if you want privacy, go to the Pacific Ocean, strip off all your clothes, and dive in. And maybe you'll have privacy, but you probably won't, because there'll be some sonar down there tracking your movements. So privacy is a great concept. As I said, there are ways to try to enforce it if you get industry to participate and make them accountable, where you can specify what you want or what you don't want. But too often we're lazy, we give it up. I hit agree all the time, knowing that they're going to abuse what they find. It's not an easy answer to, oh yes, we should have privacy again. It's not going to happen. And for many interesting reasons, some of which are good. Sorry.
Thank you.
Dr. Kleinrock, do we have time for one more question?
Sure.
Alan Velasco, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Kleinrock. Very interesting talk. I was wondering, do you think that the world will fully switch to IPv6 in the near future?
No. It's been around for a long time. It's a little clumsy. It's not being adopted. There's a whole legacy system behind it. I'm not saying no because I think it's a bad protocol. I think it's just observing what's not happened is the problem. There's another aspect about IPv6 which I like to point out. You know, the address space for the IP protocol has continued to increase. Initially, the space was 64 machines, 64 addresses, and then went 8 bits and went up and up and up, and they keep increasing it. And now they say, well, we have enough addresses to give one address to every molecule in the universe, so it must be enough. And I say no, because how about every pair of molecules and every triplet of molecules? How about the community aspect? So I'd like to design a protocol where you have a variable length and that you're able to change that length according to the need, either in the future or for a particular application. Because I think this game of every time we change it, it's a whole new legacy system we have to make it adaptable to, is a pain. And some of that applies to IPv6. So I'm not a big fan of IPv6, even though it's got good intentions and it's got, got good security, increases the address space and all the rest. It's not happening.
Thank you very much. I think the same.
Okay.
Okay.
By the way, I must say, it's a pleasure to see these young faces here. I'm so happy the audience is budding young people who are moving into the domain. So it's been very nice.
We have a lot of more questions and hands raised, but we don't have enough time. We appreciate a lot all your time, all your effort to be here with us at Tech de Monterrey. And we would like to have you again soon, if you can, maybe next future. And we want to thank you. And also all the people that are here in this session from all the country. all the students and a lot of professors also that are here, and all the students of other universities. And also I want to thanks to Montserrat Cruz to make this possible, and mainly Mr. Leonard Kleinrock. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Professor Davalos. I really appreciate it. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you all. Good luck to you all.
Thank you very much to everybody. And we have a lot of raised hands, but we don't have enough time. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Kleinrock, for your time.
Bye, bye to everybody.
Thanks
Adiós
for the
a todos. Hasta luego. Thank you, Mr. Kleinrock. Bye.
Thank you.